Hey, welcome, and thank you for joining us here in the audience and, of course, online. I'm Julia White, and I'm an executive board member at SAP, and I'm thrilled to be joined by a remarkable set of panelists here to share their experiences and their insight about building a responsible supply network, a hot topic right now in that front. Before I jump in, a little bit of housekeeping. We are going to take questions in the room, so please start thinking about those. And then also for those online, can use the Slido QR code here to submit questions, and I will do my best to get the top voted questions as part of our Q&A at the end. So with that piece of it. And then also we are running a poll pretty soon here that you can kind of put in, what do you think about when you hear responsible supply network? So we'll take your answers, and we'll also ask our panelists here in our introduction as well. So a little housekeeping there. And then also, I just want to make sure that we represent that part of the session is capable because of 100 organizations that collectively reach 2 billion people globally through the Global Alliance for Social Entrepreneurship, and proud that SAP is part of that network as well. So, with that, a little bit of context for our conversation here. So I think we've probably all seen, heard, read, experienced firsthand the supply chain disruptions that are going on. I've actually been talking to a lot of supply chain leaders here at WEF, and my favorite quote this week was from a manufacturer who said, Julia, however bad you think it is, it's actually 2 times worse. So just to keep it real in terms of that perspective, right? But simultaneously, as we know, there's also incredible customer demand as well as business imperatives to bring more social entrepreneurship into the supply chain and improve sustainability, whether it's carbon tracking, scope 1, 2, 3, or from an equity perspective, right, in terms of human rights violations within the supply network as well. So having to bring those things together. So that's the conversation today of how as we adjust our supply chains from global efficiency to resiliency and even more regional resiliency, how do we pivot that with the opportunity to bring more sustainability, more responsible entrepreneurship into that supply chain, and hopefully also learn how to do it to increase resiliency, right, not just the social impact as well on that front. And there's some great research actually from Yunus Social Business Organization that reports that 85% of supply chain leaders, they say that sustainability is actually a competitive differentiator for their company, and that they see their procurement dollars as actually one of the most impactful ways their company can both drive business goals but also social and human goals as well. So a very powerful mechanism if we do it well. So we have an excellent group of people here to have this conversation. SAP, we obviously build supply chain technology, but we don't run them. But luckily, these lovely leaders do to talk about that. So I want to first introduce everyone across the panel. First, we have Ezgi Barsonas from the Chief Sustainability Officer of AB and InBev. Welcome. And then we have George Oliver, the Chairman and CEO of Johnson Controls. Good morning. Followed by Nicola Golombek, the Executive Director of the Yellowwoods Holdings, and then Dr. Both Professor and Dr. Michael Seuss, the Chairman of Oerlikon Management AG. So welcome. Great to have all of you. Now, I don't know if we can get the poll up in terms of what the audience said in terms of what they think about in a responsible supply chain. But I wanted to start, warm-up question for all of us. Start this way. And how do you think about responsible supply network in your course of business?
Yeah, thank you for having me. So at AB InBev, with operations across nearly 50 markets around the world, a lot of our products are sourced, brewed, and enjoyed locally. So we have a diversity of supply chain across the world, and the way we think about responsible supplier networks is really a thriving supplier base that is able to address the social, economic, and environmental challenges that are relevant and material to their business and their success. Okay. So for us, this is about supply security in the long run. So when we wear that long-term hat, you have to invest in a responsible supplier network.
Got it. George.
Yeah, so Johnson Controls, we're about a $26 billion company. We procure both products and services about 15, 16 billion. So it is significant, and it is an extension of what we do and how we create value for our customers and shareholders. And when I think about being more responsible supply chain, it's making sure that we not only driving ethical compliance, but really embracing our values and ultimately the commitments we've made to ESG and doing it wing to wing, so that as we make commitments that we're doing it with full visibility right through our supply chain. And so a lot of what we've done is also focused on the underutilized population. So a lot of what we do is continue to develop. We are localized with what we do across all of the markets we serve, and making sure that we're developing new suppliers more diverse suppliers with the commitments that we're making, which ultimately has led to about a $500 million buy for us from diverse suppliers. So it's not only the ethics, the compliance, the making sure that we're developing that underutilized resource, and then making sure that from an accountability standpoint, we have a sustainable procurement program that we can then measure ourselves end to end to make sure that we're delivering on our commitments.
We'll come back on more on that one for sure. Nicola.
Hi, thank you. So we're an investment group with holdings in global brands like Nando's, Hollard, and others that are all companies born in South Africa and now are global multinationals. And we have a sort of deep, long approach to long-term value and a deep belief that the success of businesses relies on inclusive economy. So ensuring that as we succeed in business, we're sharing value and we're including many who are excluded from the economic benefits in our value chains. And that's a sort of abiding philosophy that runs throughout our group of companies. What that looks like in practice is a significant commitment to directing a lot of our global procurement to Southern Africa and working in whether it's agriculture value chains, whether it's design sector value chains, insurance value chains, to create inclusive economic participation through the business that we do and the way we do our business.
Fantastic. And Michael.
So with Oerlikon, we're operating mainly in two sectors. On the metal coating side, and we're building machines for textile and non-textile applications where you do the yarn polymer based. And by that, we are somehow active in 35 countries, and to get in very often smaller entities. I do service centers somehow in Vietnam or in Chile or wherever. Yeah. So what we have given us is an Oerlikon code of conduct for supplier and for our people.
Okay.
All of them have to move through that again and again, and there is I would add, so not the typical, but the important ones that avoid forced labor. What's about child work? What's about environmental issues? Do they working under good conditions, security-wise as environmental-wise?
Yep.
And then we are cooperating with EcoVadis, which is which they have a huge database. Yep. Much bigger than what we can, but we provide our data, we get others. That helps a lot. And in the end, you have to do audits. We did last year 162 audits on suppliers, really checking if they're following that. And let's say that works. On the other hand, you have on metal base, we're sourcing wherever we can from the best nations you can go. We're doing our nickel powders from Australia. We do our nickel feedstock from Canada. But if you go for cobalt, you have to go to Congo. At least we do it with Glencore, where you have certain standards. The others alternatives are Chinese, which don't have these standards, even though they're open that you can check it. Right. But sometimes you have to balance. If you need cobalt, there are limited access.
Right, right. And you even get at the beginning of that, you can have standards, but getting at that data and to understand it is, of course, challenging. So, Eske, I wanted to start with you on that topic, coming from more the sustainability officer perspective. Interested in what you're doing that's working within the ABM supply chain, and getting into how do we get the visibility, how do you bring that right information to make, if you have standards, but how do you actually meet them and kind of lived experiences you've seen?
Yeah, so at AB InBev, again, with operations around the world, we are a global local company. Beer is inclusive, it is natural, it is local, and our inclusivity extends beyond our product portfolio into how we engage with value chain partners, from the tens of thousands of smallholder farmers that provide our raw materials, mainly barley, but also local crops like sorghum, cassava, all the way to downstream to the 6 million small, medium-sized enterprises, small retailers, mom and pop shops that sell our products around the world, many of whom in developing markets. So for us, that inclusivity is something that we have to bring, as we're investing in local economies and local supply chains, because our consumers are local. We are producing our products locally. And again, as I mentioned earlier, for us, this is about supply security and how you think about the impacts of climate change, the growing water stress, the recycling supply chains that may have been disrupted throughout the pandemic, or more broadly, building climate resilience. A lot of the climate discussions and climate finance has been going into climate mitigation efforts, and there is something to be said about the importance of climate adaptation and how big companies like ours can work with smaller suppliers in making them more resilient and building a future fit business as well. So about 5 years ago, we actually moved our sustainability function under our procurement team. So our procurement teams now carry a sustainability title as well. And together with that comes an increased alignment on the strategic priorities in how we design the sustainable and responsible supply chains, but also in how we cascade targets to our teams around the world that are linked to their bonus. So now what this does is it allows us to move the collaboration and the discussions with the suppliers from a more transactional place to a more strategic, collaborative, inclusive conversation as well. And it allows you to think about the diversity of that supplier, what they bring to the table, and what you can bring to the table to make them stronger, more resilient, more innovative as well.
So bonus on the procurement team. Is that what you're saying?
That's right, yes. It has to be integrated, right? Because I think if you have a separate sustainable procurement practice, it has to be integrated into the core procurement operations, and of course everything we do is driven by our responsible sourcing policy, but day in, day out, this really allows us to think about the economic, social, environmental challenges that we're facing that therefore are also shared across the value chain and our suppliers are facing as well, so we're tackling them together.
Got it. Now George, you talked about how you're working with and trying to build out this ecosystem and doing it, and you talked about kind of end to end, really trying to be comprehensive. So interested in what, how you've done that and what it looks like.
So I would start by saying what Johnson Controls does is deliver sustainability to our customers. And so we've been doing this for decades. We are building management systems, HVAC systems for buildings. And so we've been at this for a long time. And so as we've been doing that, our customers are asking, making sure that we're delivering, our commitments to them, making sure that we're doing it end to end. So we had been building out our own assessment platform within Johnson Controls because we have a very complex supply chain. We have not only our building management system, a lot of electrical components that are sourced globally, and then in more of our mechanical products, mechanical components that are sourced globally. And so to be able to manage that and do it consistently, we needed a platform. So we had, almost 1,000, suppliers on our own platform, and then we engaged with the EcoVadis, which is the highest, growth platform that now is spanning the entire supply chain. And I think there's over 85,000?
90,000.
90,000 suppliers that are on there. And for us, it was to take what we were doing internally and then leverage a standard that's across the supply chain that would enable us to be able to accelerate. And so I think we've now doubled the suppliers that are on the platform so we can measure end-to-end what we've committed to do and how they're contributing to what we've committed to get to. We'll get to 55% operational savings from emissions reductions by 2030. We've committed to be net zero by 2040. And then more important now, we've created solutions to get to net zero buildings to our customers. And so you can imagine when we're selling net zero buildings, the first question is, show me how you're doing it yourself within your own four walls. And so you've got to walk the talk, you've got to be a leader, you've got to make sure that you have transparency to the entire carbon chain with what we do. And I think we've made a lot of progress. And with that, we put groups of some of our more strategic suppliers that we within panels that be able to continue improvement and leverage best practices and making sure that we're continuing to enhance the overall execution of that. So I think those, and then the last is, like I said earlier in my opening remarks, is how do we really put resources to work to develop the underutilized populations? Because today it's still, and these are companies that are owned, operated, controlled by underutilized populations across the globe, and we've had incredible success in being able to do that. And in many cases, with all of the challenges that we've had with the global supply chain, where we've developed these local suppliers, they've been, in many cases, more successful than others that have been leveraged, that have been more impacted by the overall global shortages. So those are some of the things that we're doing.
Yeah, and I've heard that again and again this week, of the resilience is actually stronger with some of these local and kind of social entrepreneurs as well. So there's the double benefit. Now, you got into kind of the overall approach to metrics. And Nicola, I'd love your perspective on the incentives. How do we create the right incentives? You talked about bonusing to the procurement team and that type of thing, but to get large enterprises to make this a standard, right? And the organizations you work with, and how does that work to come together?
So as a shareholder, I mean, we've taken the view that these metrics can't belong to a supply chain procurement team. They have to belong to the chief executive. And so, we have a very clear contracting framework, both in short and long-term incentives with our executives around their both financial and social and economic and environmental performance. And that extends not just to, we want to, what we call, be proud of the way we do business and we make money. So that's what we would call responsible in the framework of what a number of people have mentioned. But we talk about being a positive contributor and creating net positive value as we create financial value. So, if we're talking about smallholder farmers, let's just use it as an example, right? Because it was mentioned. People who need and want to be part of global supply chains, right? If they are to be resilient as households, to progress as households, to progress as communities, they need to be part of formal value chains. But what it actually takes to make that happen actually requires more than procurement, right? It requires, firstly, a deliberate decision to procure from suppliers who may not be ready to supply, to agree a time frame by which there may be trade-offs to be made on price, there may be trade-offs to be made on investments that need to be made in suppliers. And not just to the suppliers themselves, but to the ecosystems that support those suppliers and their resilience. But when you do that, and when you make those kinds of investments, like we procure 100% of the chili in Nando's, for example, the chili that is in Nando's famous peri-peri sauce that many of you might know. 100% of the chilies and the spices increasingly are purchased out of Southern Africa. But we've had to build out the whole value chain in order to do that. What does it take for an African spice value chain to be competitive with a Chinese spice value chain? And I think that when you see business as a partner to a group of potential suppliers or existing suppliers in a local ecosystem, and you really commit to a long-term value creation partnership, then I think you start to get a lot of what I would call the positive outcomes that I would really say are the way we need to start measuring the S in the ESG, is not in what risks we don't create or what negative externalities we don't create, but actually what positive social contribution we're making. And that often involves not doing things on our own. And I really want to stress that we've talked a lot about ecosystem. I mean, the only way for smallholder farmers that we procure from to really progress is to have other off-takers as well. To be able to rotate their crops, to be able to have other off-takers, to be able to create cash smoothing in their own worlds. And what we've been able to do because of the diversity of our group is then crowd in other players. Insurers play a really important role in that value chain. So our insurers now are some of the innovators in insurance for smallholder farmers and those agriculture value chains. So but we work with our competitors, we work with our partners, we work with other players in a place, in a geography. And I think that those are the kinds of solutions that we are finding are really is what is going to define, let me call it the S in ESG.
Got it, yeah. And doing some research around the perceptions around this. I feel like there's some myth busting to do around these type of companies can't scale, they can't be price competitive, they can't give you, assurances, as you talked about. And then, but then the recent study from YSB and BCG, actually, that I got a preview to, was interesting that 80% of the supply chain leaders said that they found that working with these enterprises are price competitive and they can give quality and cost assurances, and that 60% are competitive on volumes as well, which surprised me. I think there's a perception gap there, but yet 70% said they struggle to identify the right businesses in that ecosystem. So, Michael, I'm a believer, like if this was easy, we would have already done it. We're not. I said, so interested in, as a leader of a large organization, there's pain points, there's risks. How do you think about that as you think about bringing in more of responsible supply chain processes? So what are those obstacles we still haven't overcome?
There's always the same phrase, but in that case it's really true. There is more chances and opportunities than risks. Because as a company like Oerlikon, we are by business we are sustainable. Because if you coat something to prolong the lifetime or to get better utilization by lowering tribological aspects or getting higher temperature environment, everything is contributing for a longer sustainability of the product. So if you want to be part of that story, you have to follow that. So for our suppliers, it's mandatory. Either they are part of our story or they're out. There's not even motivation. So, and we will find alternatives. You have maybe the most difficult alternatives is if you go to raw materials. Yeah. Because you need for metal coatings, you need nickel or copper.
Right.
But even there, you have a AI-based materials development, and then you can look for different alternatives, which gets close to the required specification and maybe does not need that source or that part of materials.
Interesting.
And to the carbon emissions question, our company is doing 148,000 tons of carbon dioxide and will be 2030 carbon zero. That's not huge. Our contribution only in single applications, for example, the coatings we have in jet engines, commercial jet engines, is saving annually 25 million tons of carbon dioxide. That's the 180 times more than what we as a whole company are doing. So we have to look here more and more as well what we are doing to have the credibility that we are doing something.
Got it.
But the real leverage is in the applications. The leverage is really where the customer value for our customers to help them either to save carbon emissions or what's, in my eyes, equally important, to understand, and we had these discussions yesterday with our advanced manufacturing group, waste is a resource. Any material that goes in a battery today, we have to have a way to get it out again, otherwise it's a lost resource. And as being the biggest markets, US and Europe are the biggest markets in the world. We get a lot of products. So we have a lot of resources which are sitting then in our markets. And we have to consider that as a source for future growth.
Got it.
And to get the companies buying into that. And to have a responsibility for your value chain. So on our polymer-based yarn business, we're actually working on biodegradables and on recycling. So biodegradables is not good for clothes because you don't want to have a composting cloth. But it's for other stuff, like Pampers, where you don't want to recycle, most probably. So, but on the other hand, you get more and more into a situation, as I learned from our teams, from Georg Stausberg, who is responsible for that, 30% today is already recycled, but it's recycled bottles. You don't want to have recycled bottles, you want to have recycled textiles. And the recycled bottles should be in the bottles. So you will see more and more closed circles. And this is something really sustainable. And their suppliers, either they discover this is an opportunity for me, or sooner or later they will be out. Because they're not supporting the story of the company they are supplying to.
Yeah. I think when you're so clear with that mindset, Drew, it drives the right innovation, right? Rather than just looking at for the same thing, you're going to look at the problem differently. And how do you innovate? Both you, but within your company, but also your supply chain.
But that's our strength because we're a material-based science and engineering company. So we are always thinking about innovation technology. Unfortunately, people very often underestimate the power of technology. Right. They listen, they believe, but they don't buy in, especially our politicians. So and here we have to fully understand the power of technology if you do it on a consistent, mid and long-term way.
Right.
And don't give targets and then tell the industry how they have to make it and in which time frame. Right. Sometimes it takes longer, and sometimes you will use a different technology, and not that what a politician thinks it should be.
Yes. Now, on the note of policy opportunities here, since we have a mixed audience, Nicola, you brought a great example to me of within our value chains, we don't want to have child labor, as an example. But then there's local farms that are family businesses, right? And inclusive of the kids. And the policies need to be worked out there. So interested in your perspective on some of those things we still haven't solved.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important question. You know, even when, and I think this is such a difficult moment to weigh these different issues, because on the one hand, it is really important, and as you say, we need to create standards, we need to create frameworks that say, you know, for me in Europe, for me in America, I'm going to procure and I'm going to meet these standards, and I can make that promise to my consumers. We are at risk, though, of setting those standards in a way that creates a whole new phase of exclusion. Because we are very likely, firstly, to set standards that many suppliers in many developing countries will not be able to meet, right? And that will either sort of create a huge new economy of intermediaries who really suck up all the financial value, sort of a little like happened in the aid world over the last several decades, you know, or actually create the end of globalization and, you know, a complete sort of, you know, a drive towards local sourcing, a drive towards localization in a way that then compounds the exclusion of huge parts of the world from participation in these value chains. So I'm just encouraging that the standard setting process that is happening around particularly the metrics for S. I'm going to just keep coming back to the S in ESG because I feel like the ones for environment are easier to do. They've been more naturally focused on scientific measures, and they've been worked on for longer. I think the ones on S, we've got measures around being responsible, as in don't kill people, you know, in your supply chain, right? Don't have slave labor in your supply chain. But what are the positive metrics, and how are they going to help us tackle the other crisis we face, which is economic inequality that creates massive instability in every society in the world, and will make our transitions and our ability to deal with everything else as humans, you know, impossible, because you know, our societies and our social contracts are so broken. So we have to deal with this economic inequality issue, and our standards mustn't work against that.
Can I build on that?
Please, yeah.
So I actually quite like what Nicola mentioned earlier, and I think some of the other panelists mentioned it as well, the network approach, and that's why I really like how we're framing this around responsible supplier networks. You know, I always like to say that value chains are two-dimensional, and if we're going to tackle any and all of these broader ESG topics, we're going to have to think three-dimensionally, right? And I call them value constellations. So in how we think of, you know, rotational crops was an example that Nicola gave. Barley is a rotational crop, right? In how we think of assessing a farmer income, or assessing the environmental impact of that land use, that crop production, you have to look at not only your own crop and your own offtake, but more broadly, you know, how that farmer is working, what are the economic, social, environmental challenges that they're trying to tackle. So for us, this has definitely been an approach, and you see that all the way across your value chain. Another example given in materials, we see this in post-consumer packaging waste collection. You know, in many markets in developing countries, I think you see the consumer behavior, the policy that is going to drive recycling, and there's, you know, formal recycling streams. And then in many other countries around the world, these are mainly managed by informal recycling supply chains. And we see recycling as an environmental issue. It actually is a social issue. It's a human issue in how we collect, how those waste pickers informally go and collect and divert, you know, packaging or other waste that is actually not waste. There's a monetary value associated with it away from landfill. So increasingly what we're seeing is that the environmental, social, and economic kind of dimensions of sustainability are really becoming very interconnected and very interlinked. And if we're going to really tackle these challenges, we can't just do them with our existing supplier base.
Right.
So one thing that, at ABI, what we started looking at is, again, taking that value constellation or that network approach and saying, if we can't tackle some of these challenges ourselves, or it's not something that we can do in our existing supplier base with the large or medium or small suppliers that we're working with, we launched a 100+ Sustainability Accelerator 3 years ago to invite startups to come and be part of our supplier network. What we've learned in that process is it's really difficult for a startup to be part of a large organization.
Right.
And you have to do a lot of hand-holding throughout the procurement processes. You have to create an enabling environment to onboard them appropriately. You have to think differently about IP, about preferred payment terms. And so for all these things, as we're thinking of responsibility, and within the supplier networks, there's so many angles that we can come at it. And the focus on S, we can't just, in today's metrics, just measure it with our direct relationship with that supplier. We have to really look at it from an ecosystem point of view.
Absolutely makes sense. All right, I'm seeing the questions piling up. So I'm going to go ahead and turn to questions in the room now, if anyone wants to ask here, and then I'll look at the online ones as well. So anyone in the room? Yes, over here. I don't know if you have a microphone. Yeah.
I'm hearing a lot of what companies are doing, and also within various partnerships, I guess, within their own value networks, constellations, what have you. I guess one of the, so it's Jagstra, University of Cambridge, I should add. Looking at supply chains, I see the need for sector-wide initiatives, and therefore the role of pre-competitive collaboration in making the big strides to infrastructure investment, technology investment. But I'm not hearing too much of that pre-competitive collaboration conversation, which I'm sure is taking place. So over to the panel to maybe explore.
Well, I'll take that. One of the things that we were a founding member is the First Movers Coalition that is focused on high carbon industries. So steel, cement, transportation, aviation's a big part of that. And then the more recent ones have been carbon capture as well as aluminum, where companies are making commitments, because what's disadvantaged is that these companies that have been innovative in developing low carbon materials and the like don't have the scale to be able to compete, to make it economic, make it competitive economically. And so it is gaining momentum, significant momentum. The WEF has been supportive of it with Secretary Kerry from the U.S. And now there's, I believe, roughly about 60 companies that have signed up. And like, for instance, for us, it's steel. So steel is a significant material that we consume. And so we've committed, right out of the gate, that we're going to work with suppliers developing a low carbon steel and commit a certain percentage. Initially it's 10%, but it's a start of getting the scale from across the industry to be able to make them competitive, to be able to significantly reduce the carbon. And so I think it's commitments like that, leveraging the overall network or the overall industry, I think is how we're going to really move the needle.
And Nicola wanted to answer, but also it's like, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's vital to success in a number of areas. The first mover issue. We had an example in the insurance industry in our country, who could be big drivers of a consumer switch to a solar or a water heating from other forms of electricity. And the insurance industry had to behave pre-competitively to drive that switch in consumer behavior. I mean, I think that there are lots of innovations that do require a pre-competitive industry-led initiatives. But I also think I just want to come back to the idea of integrated value chains as well, because I think that sometimes it's in your industry and sometimes it's in your value chain, which isn't your competitors, but it's in this sort of strange mix of bedfellows that you have to kind of organize with. And in my experience, I mean, I've worked for many, many years orchestrating, business-to-business partnerships, and then business-to-government partnerships, and government-to-government partnerships, and all these kinds of these multi-sector coalitions that have to get built. And I think these are muscles that corporate leaders really need to build. this ability to work outside, because often my industry I'm quite comfortable in, working outside of my industry and outside of my, working with government and others, much harder. And I think this is a leadership question that is essential if we're going to crack some of these issues.
But the pre-competitive corporations requires the ability of companies to share. Because if you can put 60 companies together, everybody waits on the other one to have a good example. And then you have to share a good example, and we have all together to understand we can bake a bigger pie and get a bigger piece of that instead of struggling around the crunches. So, but the ability to share in the industries are different. Roland was my CEO of Oerlikon, and he worked in aerospace a long while as I did. Jet engine industry was always able to cooperate because the challenge has been that big, it was always too big for one alone. A similar setup in the energy sector was never able to cooperate. They've always been competing like hell. So Siemens with GE, with Alstom as they existed, or with Mitsubishi, only 4 companies. In aerospace, jet engine was 10 companies. In the end, it was always 2 groups. So do we find the right group of people, of companies then to build that together? And this is the ability to share, to be open-minded. That you win more as you lose if you participate.
Right, right.
And someone has to take a lead.
Right. Or maybe in more competitive industries, Nicholas said, it's more looking within the value chain than across the industry as well, potentially both. But yeah, as you.
I would say, I think as the beverage industry, I guess it's fair to say we've been doing this fairly well in how we tackle our understanding of the growing water stress, how we look for collective action solutions or efforts within a watershed that is a high-risk area, in how we think of eco-coolers with our beverage partners so that we can continue to push out, drive technology development, but also push out those eco-coolers to the retailers. And that's all within the sector, right? But beyond the sector, the 100+ accelerator example that I gave, after first 2 years and the success that we've had, we've actually invited Unilever, Coca-Cola, and Colgate-Palmolive to join us. And now, for CPG companies, we're looking to identify innovative solutions to come in and pilot within our organizations or value chains and then scale those initiatives. And in some cases, it's the same use case application. In other cases, it's actually a different use case application of the same solution that we're trying to pilot and share the learnings with. So I think there's different ways we can go about this. And around the world, we also have incubators, 100+ labs, so they're a little bit earlier stage. And into that, we actually invited our value chain partners, the retailers on one hand and our suppliers on the other hand. So there is, I think, increasingly growing understanding and momentum around let's get down and work together, right? I think, 3 to 5 years ago, that the conversation was more around let's announce a new coalition, let's announce a collective pledge. And now, increasingly, the companies, we are asking ourselves, what are we doing? Let's actually look at our geographic footprint, look at our shared challenges, look at the technology solutions that we both want to invest in and advance that technology development.
Yeah, back to that constellation. I think that's a great mindset, but an approach on it. All right, we have one more question here. Let's see. How can we be more intentional and diversity with diversity and social sourcing? Could this be shared in transparent ways, and is it clear where and how value is created? So, kind of giving to that measurement. George, you sound.
Yeah, so I think you have to be very intentional, meaning that you, no different than when you're building an organization and building diversity and really being deliberate, understanding where the talent is and how you develop that talent to make sure that you're driving diversity. The same applies to supply base. And so you have to be very intentional relative to the suppliers you're developing, and that's what we've been doing. We've been doing this for a period of time, and we're not where we'd like to be honest. But it does take a commitment. It takes investment. It takes a little bit of time, but it's got to be measured. You got to measure it. You got to understand where the opportunities are, where these underrepresented populations are, and what can be done to be able to incentivize them and help them be able to scale and be positioned to be able to successfully compete and be able to support our business. And so it's a constant process, and it's got to be measured, and there's got to be accountability with the actions. And we're pretty proud of what we've done, but we're not, at a place that we think is our entitlement. We got a lot more that can be done.
Right. And do you feel good about the ability to measure, or is that the work in process?
Well, we were doing that ourselves, and then the EcoVadis, which I think this is going to be very helpful because it'll set a standard. And
Got it.
And I think for everything we're trying to do, it's about speed. And I think we all have been challenged to redesign our supply chains. And I think we have a real opportunity, especially as it relates to ESG and sustainability. We have a real opportunity because to achieve net zero with what has to get done across the supply chain, we're out of time. And so the only way that we ultimately get to what we're trying to achieve, and even with the S part of that, we've got to leverage our capabilities and share the responsibility and make the commitments that ultimately I think we can achieve. And I'm encouraged. I think there's been this whole last 2 years, it's been incredibly challenging. It's uncovered all kinds of rocks that we've all shared shared the experiences. And then I've seen cooperation that I've never seen before.
Interesting.
And I think it is aligned where, whether it be companies or governments or other institutions committed to getting to where we want to be, and understanding that the ecosystem has to work as a whole to ultimately achieve the commitments we've all made. And so I think we've all come to that realization. So it's working together, sharing, leveraging best practices, and then being accountable.
Right. Nothing like a good crisis to drive a new mindset and more collaboration than we've seen in the past. So never want to waste that. Good, good, good. All right, one final round. Just one thing, in the true WEF spirit. What is the one action, one idea, one approach that you would leave the audience with in thinking about the journey forward? So I'll start with Michael. We'll work this way.
I think the one is the difficulty because I'm absolutely sure it will get worse before it gets better. So next 6 to 12 months, it's a survival mode.
Yeah.
In different industries will be different, but for all industries will be somehow difficulties by the chip crisis. And it's not only the chips, it's very often then you have everything and then a little nitty-gritty part is missing and you still cannot deliver your product. Because since COVID, it's not only Ukraine war now, since COVID, all this nice global open sky is destroyed, and we are still partially in a shock. We're moving out of that shock. We start organizing ourselves. We start even using that to move things somewhere else. But the difference in this crisis is, and I learned that out of a session, I really think it's very important. It's not a demand crisis as we have seen since Lehman. It's a supply crisis. And if you have a supply crisis, it takes you sometimes years to correct either the supply base or the level someone has to supply.
Interesting.
Because you need to invest, you need to educate, you need to train. It's not about wishful thinking, it's about finally capabilities. And what will be absolutely clear, and I think this is maybe my one takeaway, you have to compromise. You will sometimes have to compromise between carbon savings and social labor force. So maybe you do the one to protect, to say, I go there because people get better treated, but maybe the process is worse. Or I have to go in this country even knowing it's not the best political system, but it's modern technology and I need that, what they are supplying me. So to get the next 3 to 5 years is compromising and reallocating.
It's good guidance. Nicola.
So, I suppose I really wouldn't want us to waste the crisis, though. I think that, the important question is, I think everybody is making trade-offs and compromises every day.
Not taking me wrong. The target is clear. The way is clear.
And I just wanted to...
Sometimes you cannot go the direct one. You have to go a little bit around.
Find your way there.
And I just wanted to reinforce that, is that I think the more we are able to have collective narratives, as we are increasingly having around climate, but also around some of our social goals, that we all understand what we're moving towards, and that we're making sure that as we navigate this difficult period in different industries in different ways, that we're coming out the other end of whatever the other end is. I think we're going to be in perpetual crises and chaos, but that we are moving forward in the right direction, and that is and that we are leaping forward, and that we're using this, we are re-engineering processes, we are re-engineering supply chains. Let's make sure we're doing it in a way that achieves the goals we need to achieve.
Excellent.
So I'd just be quick. I would say be proactive versus reactive.
Okay.
That this is a chance in a lifetime to be really at the foundation of redesigning supply chains that are going to be much more resilient, that are going to be much more focused on ESG and ultimately achieving what we're all setting out to achieve. And I'm optimistic. I do believe it's going to take a little bit of time, but I believe that the momentum and the commitment is there, and don't wait. Take action, be accountable, join first movers, be part of the initiatives that are going to be fundamental to, I do believe that if you're proactive and embrace it, it becomes a competitive advantage with everything you do and how you compete and how you work and ultimately what you deliver. So that would be my final
A little bit
words.
of reality of it is shifting, so you can be on it or you can miss
Correct.
it. Yeah, and bring us home.
I'm going to bring it back to intentionality. I think this is about purposeful innovation. Why we do what we do really matters. That point of entry, if we don't pursue that, I think we will continue to chase innovation for the sake of innovation or partnerships for the sake of partnerships. The reason why 100+ Accelerator came about was because we knew that there were challenges that we could not tackle in our existing ecosystems. We had to go and find new partners. That meant we're making our supply chains more resilient, but it also meant we're diversifying our supplier base. Why you do what you do matters. Purposeful innovation.
Fantastic. Thank you all for joining us. Really fascinating conversation. So appreciate it.
Thank you.